The morning started like most mornings on that quiet street. A soft light stretching over the roofs, and the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn. The main character, a calm and hard-working man who preferred to stay to himself, stepped out of his front door holding a cup of warm tea. He liked taking a few minutes outside before starting his day. It helped him organize his thoughts and reminded him why he enjoyed living in this peaceful neighborhood in the first place. But on that particular morning, the peace didn't last long. The moment he reached the top of his driveway, he stopped. There were two large trucks parked directly in front of his garage door again. They were not small pickup trucks. These were oversized work trucks, wide and tall, the type that made anyone's driveway look small. They sat there like two stubborn beasts, refusing to move. He let out a slow breath, not angry, just tired. This had been happening for almost a week, and each time he hoped it was the last. He walked a little closer, studying how tightly the trucks were pressed against the garage door. There was no way he could open it even halfway. The small gap between the bumper and the door wasn't even enough to slide a suitcase through. The situation was becoming more frustrating every day. He stood there, sipping his tea, trying to think of the right way to handle this. He wasn't someone who liked conflict. He believed in talking things out, keeping things polite, and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But after several days of his garage being blocked by the same trucks, it was getting harder to stay patient. The trucks belonged to his new neighbor who had moved in only 2 weeks ago. The first time he saw them parked like this, he assumed it was just temporary. Maybe she had deliveries to unload, or maybe the movers were using the driveway to take things inside the house. But the next day, the trucks were there again, and the day after that. He took another sip of tea inside. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to access his garage like any normal person. And more importantly, that garage wasn't even just for him. It was leased to the sheriff's department for storage, something he hadn't felt the need to mention yet. It was a small arrangement he'd had for years, and had never caused a problem before. He pulled himself together and decided that today he would talk to her again. Maybe she didn't understand the inconvenience she was causing. Maybe she was just careless, not intentionally rude. He hoped that was the case. He walked down the driveway and toward the trucks, looking for signs of someone nearby. A moment later, he spotted her stepping outside her front door, holding a cup of coffee, looking half awake. She was dressed casually and didn't seem bothered by anything around her. He waved politely. "Good morning. Excuse me, can we talk for a moment?" She glanced at him like he was asking for something unreasonable. "What now?" she said, already sounding annoyed. He kept his voice calm and friendly. "Your trucks are blocking my garage again. I can't get inside or open the door. I talked to you about it a couple of days ago, but it's still happening. Could you maybe park them a little to the side instead?" She took a sip of her coffee, barely looking at the trucks. "It's street parking," she said with a shrug. "Anyone can park there. It's not my problem if you're upset about it." He tried not to let the frustration show on his face. "I understand it's a public street," he said softly, "but most neighbors try to avoid blocking garages. It makes things difficult." She set her coffee cup on the hood of one of the trucks, as if claiming ownership of the entire roadway. "Well, I'm not most neighbors," she responded sharply. "I have 2 trucks and nowhere else to put them. I'm not walking half a block every day just to make your life easier." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not asking you to walk far. Just a few feet back so the garage door can open. That's all." She laughed under her breath, not kindly. "Look, the street is free. You don't own it. If you have such a problem, maybe you should build a bigger driveway or something. But don't tell me where to park." The conversation felt like talking to a wall, but he still didn't want to escalate things. He nodded politely and stepped back. "All right," he said quietly. "I just hoped we could sort it out peacefully." She picked up her cup again and walked back toward her house without another word. He stood there for a moment, watching her disappear behind her door. The morning breeze brushed past him, but the peaceful feeling from earlier was gone. He looked at the trucks again, then at his garage, and felt a weight settle in his chest. This wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. He turned back toward his house, finished the last sip of his tea, and decided not to let his frustration guide him. He walked inside and grabbed his small notebook, where he kept important details about house maintenance, bills, and other things. He decided to start jotting down dates and times when the trucks blocked the garage, not because he wanted to start a fight, but because he had learned long ago that keeping records was always helpful. He wrote, "Trucks blocking garage day 5. Spoke to neighbor again. No improvement." He closed the notebook and placed it back inside the drawer. As the day went on, he tried to focus on his work from home. He spent most of his time at the small desk near the living room window. Every time he glanced outside, he saw the truck still sitting there, unmoved, heavy, stubborn. Around noon, the sun reached its peak, and the street outside grew hotter. Kids from a nearby house rode their bikes past, circling around the trucks because they were taking up so much space. Even they seemed annoyed, although they didn't say anything. A delivery van approached slowly, looking for a place to park. The driver hesitated, realized the trucks were blocking most of the curb, and eventually gave up, circling the block again. This wasn't just his problem anymore. The trucks were becoming a nuisance for everyone. In the afternoon, he stepped outside again. He walked around to the back of his house and checked the locked side door that led into the garage. The sheriff's department used that entrance whenever they needed access, and he always kept it clean and clear for them. But with the main door blocked, he knew it would only be a matter of time before the issue affected their operations too. Even then, he didn't want to involve them yet. He still believed things could be handled neighbor to neighbor if she just understood the situation. But the more he thought about the earlier conversation, the more he realized she didn't care at all. Evening settled, and the trucks remained where they were. He cooked a simple dinner and sat quietly at his kitchen table. While eating, he wondered how things had changed so quickly. He had lived there for years, without a single issue with any neighbor. People came and went, but everyone respected one another. This new neighbor, however, seemed determined to do whatever she wanted without thinking of anyone else. Later that night, he sat by the window again, watching the dim streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. A gentle breeze swayed the leaves on the trees. The neighborhood was quiet. Peaceful again in every way except for the 2 trucks still sitting stubbornly in front of his garage. He knew this wasn't the end of the problem, it was only the beginning. Before going to bed, he stepped outside one last time. The air was cool, and the street was silent. He stood in front of the trucks and stared at them for a long moment, wondering how something so simple, just moving a vehicle, had turned into such a big issue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't kick the tires or leave a note. He simply turned around, walked back inside, and locked the door. Reminding himself that staying calm would pay off eventually, the next day would bring its own challenges. But for now, he needed rest. He went to bed knowing he had tried to handle things politely. He also knew that eventually, the situation would force him to take another step, one he hoped he wouldn't have to take, but one he was fully prepared for. And with that thought, he closed his eyes. Unaware of just how big this small problem was about to become, the next morning arrived with the same quiet calm the neighborhood was known for. But inside the main character's home, there was a small heaviness he couldn't shake. He got out of bed, stretched, and tried to start his day like usual, telling himself not to overthink the situation. But deep down, he knew things with his neighbor were slowly getting worse, not better. He brewed a cup of tea and stood by the window, listening to the soft hum of birds outside. For a brief moment, it felt peaceful till he looked toward his garage. The 2 trucks were still there, not just parked, but positioned even more aggressively than before. One was slightly angled, taking up more space on the curb, and the other was pulled so close to the garage door that even the faint morning sun couldn't squeeze light between them. He sighed. He had hoped, even expected, that after their conversation yesterday, she might move them, or at least shift them back a little. Instead, it looked like she had doubled down. He sipped his tea quietly, wondering what kind of person decided to make things harder on purpose. He didn't want to assume anything bad about her, but her behavior was getting harder to ignore. After breakfast, he stepped outside to check if maybe she was around. The street was quiet except for a jogger passing by and a few birds hopping across the pavement. The trucks, tall and heavy, sat like unwelcome guests, refusing to leave. He walked down his driveway and studied the vehicles. The tires were slightly turned, the windows rolled up tight. They looked like they hadn't moved all night. He checked the time on his phone. It was still early enough that she might not be awake yet. He hesitated before deciding to knock on her door. He didn't want another unpleasant conversation. But he also couldn't pretend this wasn't affecting his daily life. He walked over and gently knocked. After a few seconds, the door opened a small crack. She looked half asleep and already annoyed. "What?" she said, not bothering to hide her irritation. He kept his voice calm. "Your trucks are still blocking my garage. I really need access. Could you please move them?" She rolled her eyes. "It's early. I'm not going outside just because you want me to. And like I said before, the street is free. If you don't like it, that's your issue. Try to stay patient. I understand it's a public street, but it's blocking my garage. I can't open it at all," she shrugged, in a way that made it clear she didn't care. "Not my problem. Maybe you should find another place for your stuff," felt a small knot form in his chest. She wasn't just careless, she was deliberately trying to make things difficult. He stepped back slowly. "I'm asking politely," he said, though he knew it wouldn't help. She narrowed her eyes. "Yeah, and I'm saying no. Don't bother me again." She closed the door before he could respond. For a long moment, he stood there on her porch, staring at the closed door. He wasn't angry, but the level of disrespect was starting to wear on him. He walked back to his driveway and took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. He didn't want to escalate anything, but he also couldn't just ignore the situation forever. He needed access to his garage, and it wasn't just for personal convenience. He had a responsibility as part of his agreement with the sheriff's department. Still, he held off mentioning that detail. He wanted to give her another chance, even though it was becoming clear she wouldn't change on her own. He went back inside and tried to focus on work. But the tension lingered in the back of his mind. Every now and then he glanced outside, hoping the trucks might disappear, just a sign that maybe she'd finally understood. But the hours passed, and the trucks remained right where they were. Around midday, something new happened. He heard a loud thud outside, followed by the sound of something scraping along the pavement. He peeked out the window and saw his neighbor dragging a large trash bag overflowing with junk. Instead of placing it neatly by her own bin, she left it right against his fence. She dusted off her hands and walked away without a second glance. He blinked, confused. She had never done that before. He stepped outside to check the bag. It was filled with random things, old magazines, broken plastic pieces, and what looked like leftovers from some home project. The smell wasn't strong yet, but it was unpleasant enough to make him frown. He dragged the bag away from his fence and placed it near her own bin. It wasn't a confrontation, just a simple correction. He didn't want her trash piling against his home. An hour later, he heard the same sound again. Another bag. This time she dropped it even closer to his fence. It's almost defiantly. He realized then that she wasn't just being rude. She was trying to send a message. But why? He had done nothing to provoke such behavior. He took a step back and watched her quietly. She didn't look in his direction, didn't acknowledge him at all. Instead, she walked back into her house as if she had done something perfectly normal. He moved the second bag too, feeling a bit more tired each time. Later in the afternoon, he walked around the side of his house again, checking the small door that opened into the garage. It was still clear, but the sight of the blocked main door annoyed him. He thought about the sheriff's deputies who sometimes came by to pick up or drop off equipment. If they showed up today, they wouldn't be able to access anything. That thought made him uneasy. He didn't want to cause trouble for them. As evening approached, the neighborhood began to come alive. A few people walked their dogs. Some kids played with a soccer ball in the street, weaving around the trucks with annoyed faces. A couple from down the street slowed down as they passed, giving the trucks an irritated glance. Everyone was noticing the inconvenience. The main character sat on his porch for a while, watching the sunset and the small changes in the sky. The warm colors helped calm him down, at least for a moment. But the peace didn't last. Around dinner time, he saw his neighbor step outside again. She looked toward him, smirked slightly, and then walked to her trucks. For a moment, he He felt relief. He thought she was finally going to move them. Instead, she opened the door of one truck, grabbed a small box, closed the door, and walked back inside. Leaving the trucks exactly where they were, he shook his head in disbelief. It was becoming clear she didn't just lack consideration, she enjoyed causing inconvenience. Still, he didn't want to react emotionally. He knew that responding out of frustration would only make things worse. He picked up his notebook again late that night and wrote down everything that had happened that day. The trash bags, the conversation, the unchanged parking. He wasn't collecting these notes to start trouble. He was doing it to stay organized, to keep his thoughts clear. He believed in handling things the right way, not the loud way. Before going to bed, he walked outside once more. The street was quiet, lit by the soft glow of street lamps. The trucks stood exactly where they had been all day. He rested his hand on the garage door for a second. Feeling the cool metal under his palm, he whispered to himself, "This won't last forever." He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he could feel something shifting. The situation was slowly crossing a line, and soon he would have no choice but to take the next step. For now, he simply walked back inside, locked his door, and hoped tomorrow would bring a hint of change even, though deep down, he knew it probably wouldn't. The next morning arrived quietly, but the tension that had been growing over the past week settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The main character woke up earlier than usual, feeling uneasy even before he pulled back the curtain. A small part of him hoped that something might have changed overnight, that maybe the trucks would finally be gone. But when he looked outside, the sight was the same. The trucks stood side by side, blocking his garage with the exact same stubbornness as before. They looked almost deliberate now, like they were placed there simply to remind him he wasn't going to win this easily. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, rubbing his forehead. He wasn't angry, but the constant disrespect was starting to take a toll. He wasn't someone who liked trouble. He didn't start arguments, he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't make scenes. But he had reached a point where ignoring the situation was no longer an option. He went into the kitchen, made a cup of tea, and stood near the window again, trying to gather his thoughts. The soft morning light spread across the street, and the neighborhood slowly began to wake. A dog barked in the distance, a car door shut somewhere nearby, and the sound of someone sweeping their porch traveled faintly through the air. It should have been a peaceful morning, but he couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Around mid-morning, he heard the familiar sound of a vehicle approaching. At first, he didn't think much of it. Cars came and went all day. But then he heard the sound of tires slowing down, and finally, a gentle knock on his front door when he opened it. A sheriff's deputy stood outside wearing a calm expression and holding a clipboard. The deputy greeted him politely. "Morning." "We came by to access the storage space in your garage," the deputy said. "But it looks like something is blocking the entrance." The main character felt the air tighten around him. This was the moment he had hoped would never come. He stepped out and pointed toward the trucks. "They've been parked like this for days," he explained. "I've talked to the neighbor several times, but she refuses to move them." The deputy studied the trucks with a raised eyebrow. "That's a problem," he said calmly. "We need access to the equipment inside. It's part of our regular rotation." The main character nodded. "I know. I've tried my best to handle it without causing issues, but she doesn't want to listen. She says the street is free to everyone." The deputy took a slow breath. "I understand public streets," he said, "but blocking official access is different. We'll have to speak to her." The main character felt a mix of relief and hesitation. He didn't want conflict. But this wasn't something he could solve alone anymore. The deputy motioned for another officer in the car to join him. They both walked over to the neighbor's house, while the main character stayed near his driveway. Watching from a respectful distance, the deputies knocked firmly on her door. The sound echoed through the street. A moment later, the neighbor opened the door slightly, looking confused at first, then irritated. "What?" she snapped. "Why are you knocking like that?" One deputy spoke in a calm, professional tone. "Ma'am, we need you to move your trucks. They're blocking access to sheriff property stored in the garage next door." She blinked, not believing what she heard. Sheriff property. In his garage? She asked, pointing toward the main character as if accusing him of something. The deputy nodded. Yes, we have an active lease agreement for that space. We need access today. Her expression shifted instantly from irritated to defensive. Oh, I don't believe that, she said, folding her arms across her chest. He's probably lying. He's been complaining about my parking since the day I moved in. The deputy shook his head politely. Ma'am, we're not here because of a complaint. We're here because we need access to our equipment. Those trucks need to be moved immediately. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Well, I'm not moving them. The street is public. You can't tell me where to park. If he has a problem, that's on him. The deputies exchanged a look. The second deputy stepped forward slightly, ma'am. Oh. Blocking a space leased to law enforcement is not the same as blocking a private garage. This falls under obstruction, and we need cooperation. She grew louder. Obstruction? Really? You're saying my trucks are some kind of threat? This is ridiculous, her tone carried across the street. Loud enough that a few neighbors stepped outside, pretending to check their mail while actually listening in. The main character watched quietly, not wanting to add fuel to the fire. This wasn't his moment anymore. It was between her and the deputies. The first deputy tried one more time. Speaking calmly, ma'am, we just need the trucks moved. That's all. This doesn't need to become a bigger issue, but she refused. She tightened her grip on the door and gave them a glare. No, she said flatly. I'm not moving anything. Do whatever you want. The deputies stood there for a moment, taking in her words. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't argue. They simply noted her refusal. The first deputy wrote something down on his clipboard, then looked at her again. All right, ma'am, he said. Since you've refused to cooperate, we'll move to the next step. She opened her mouth to respond, but the deputy politely stepped back, signaling that the conversation was over. The deputies returned to the main character and explained the situation. She refused to move them. He asked softly. Completely, one deputy said. But we have procedures for this. Don't worry. You did your part. He nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief. I didn't want it to reach this point, he said honestly. We understand, the deputy replied. You handled it respectfully. Now it's our turn. The deputies contacted their towing service and began documenting the situation. They took photos of the trucks from several angles, ensuring they captured every detail. They recorded the blocked entrance, the position of the vehicles, the time, and the condition of the area. The neighbor watched through her window. Her lips pressed tightly together, but she didn't come outside again, as the deputies worked. The main character stood aside, feeling strangely calm. He hadn't wanted drama, but the situation had reached a level where he couldn't fix it alone. The law had to step in. About 30 minutes later, 2 tow trucks arrived. They moved slowly down the street, their lights flashing softly. The drivers hopped out, assessed the situation, and nodded at the deputies. The process was professional and quiet. The deputies explained which trucks needed to be taken and documented everything carefully. The main character stayed out of the way. Watching from his porch, a few neighbors lingered outside, whispering quietly but keeping a respectful distance. The tow drivers hooked up the first truck. The heavy machine lifted it off the ground carefully, its weight shifting as the chains tightened. The second truck was connected shortly after. The deputies remained nearby, ensuring everything was done properly as the trucks were slowly pulled away. The main character couldn't help feeling a strange sense of relief. Not happiness. It's just the relief that came from knowing things were finally moving toward a resolution. Once the tow trucks drove off, the deputies turned to him. You should have access now, one said. He nodded gratefully. Thank you. I appreciate it. They gave him a reassuring nod. If anything else happens, document it and let us know. But for now, things should be fine. He watched them leave and then turned toward his garage. For the first time in days, he could see the door fully. No trucks blocking it, no stubborn metal masses preventing him from carrying out his responsibilities. He walked toward it slowly, feeling the quiet around him shift. The air felt lighter. The street looked wider. The tension that had been building for days finally started to ease. But even as he stood there, appreciating the clear space, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. The neighbor wasn't the kind of person to accept consequences quietly. She would react, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually he just didn't know how. With a slow breath, he opened the small side door to the garage, checked the interior, and made sure everything was exactly as it should be. For now, peace had returned to his driveway, but the calm after a storm can sometimes be the warning of another one coming. And deep down, he could feel it. This situation wasn't finished yet. The next morning began with a strange mix of calm and tension. The sun had barely risen, but the man was already awake, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea in his hands, thinking about everything that had unfolded over the last 2 days. He kept replaying the scene from the night before, the officers standing beside the giant trucks, the woman arguing loudly, her voice echoing all over the street, and the final moment when they told her she needed to move the vehicles immediately. It was a relief, of course, but it was also the beginning of something bigger, because he could feel it. She wouldn't let this go. As he finished his tea, he glanced through the window and saw something surprising. The driveway was clear, completely clear. No trucks, no obstacles, nothing blocking his garage. For a moment, he thought maybe she had finally understood the situation and decided to step back. Maybe she had realized she was wrong. Maybe she would finally leave him in peace. But deep down, he knew it couldn't be that simple. He stepped outside to check if everything was truly normal. The morning air was cool, and the quietness of the street gave him a moment of peace. He walked around the garage, looked at the gate, then at the driveway. Everything seemed fine. He let out a slow breath. The calm before the storm, he thought. He decided to head inside and get ready for work. Even though the garage was leased to the sheriff's department, his own small workshop was inside the house, and he had orders to complete that day. He tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the situation next door. The uneasy feeling in his stomach refused to leave. Around mid-morning, while he was sanding a piece of wood, he heard loud talking outside. Not angry talking, not yet, but the kind that made you stop and listen. He paused his work and went to the window. 2 tow trucks were parked in front of his neighbor's house. The same woman stood beside them, hands on her hips, talking fast and pointing toward his garage's direction. The workers listened carefully, with confused expressions. He knew instantly what she was doing. She wasn't giving up. He stepped outside,
Just to see what she was planning.
As soon as she spotted him, she loudly told the workers, "Yes, those trucks were on his side yesterday, but now I want you to bring them back and line them up exactly here. I don't care if the space isn't legally mine. I have the right to access my yard, and his driveway is blocking me." Workers exchanged looks. One finally said, "Ma'am, we can't place trucks on someone else's private driveway. That's not how this works." She waved her hand dramatically. "You don't understand. He's been targeting me for months. I know the law. He has to keep that driveway open for community access." The man almost laughed at the absurdity of her claim. Community access? It was his driveway and his garage. But he also knew arguing wouldn't help. Not with her. Instead, he calmly said, "The officers explained last night that this is private property. You can't put anything here without permission." She turned to him with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I'm aware of what they said, but I have my own information. You'll see. You're not going to keep that garage off limits for long." Without another word, she instructed the workers to leave and stomped back into her house. The workers shrugged, got into their trucks, and drove off. The man stood there, staring at the empty driveway again. But this time, the quietness didn't feel peaceful. It felt like pressure building. Hours passed. He went back to his work, though he couldn't fully focus. Every small noise from outside made him pause. He had a feeling something else was coming, something bigger. Later in the afternoon, he received a call from the sheriff's department. The same officer who had spoken to him the night before greeted him. "Just checking in. the officer said. "We received a complaint this morning from your neighbor. She's claiming the garage is being used for illegal storage." The man closed his eyes and sighed. "I figured she might try something." "We knew it wasn't true," the officer continued, "but we wanted to let you know. If she tries anything else, just update us. We're already noting these calls." He thanked the officer, feeling a small wave of support. At least he wasn't alone. At least the officers knew what she was doing. But evening was approaching. And with it, more trouble. Just after sunset, he heard a loud bang outside. Not the kind that came from dropping tools or slamming a door. It was a heavy, sharp sound. He rushed to the front door and swung it open. A small metal trailer was now sitting sideways across the edge of his driveway. It wasn't blocking the entire space, but it was placed in a way that made driving out difficult. And standing beside it, adjusting its position, was the same woman. "You can't leave that there," he said, walking toward her. She didn't look at him. She simply said, "It's not on your property. It's touching the grass, not the pavement. That means it's fine." Even though it wasn't completely blocking his way, he knew why it was there. She wanted to make everything inconvenient. She wanted to poke and push until he snapped. But he wasn't going to do that. He took a photo of the trailer, then calmly returned inside. He didn't bother arguing. She wanted a reaction, but he wasn't giving her one. The next morning, he woke up with determination. Enough was enough. He gathered every document related to the garage's lease, the agreement with the sheriff's department, and his property records. He placed them neatly in a folder and prepared to take them to the department. Before leaving, he looked out the window again. This time, the trailer was gone. Completely gone. It was as if she had never placed it there. He almost smiled. Maybe she realized she'd gone too far. Maybe she understood that he had proof on his side. But as he drove to the sheriff's office, a strange thought crossed his mind. What if she was simply preparing something else? When he arrived, he met with the officer who managed the lease. The officer listened carefully, flipping through the documents. "You've handled this well," the officer said. "We'll document everything. And don't worry about your neighbor's attempts. Nothing she's doing is legal, but it's clear she's trying to create pressure." The man nodded. "I just don't want things to get worse. I'll handle whatever comes next," the officer assured him. He left the office feeling a little better. But he knew the situation wasn't over. Not yet. And when he returned home, understood that clearly. A large sign was now staked into the ground at the edge of his driveway. A bright, bold sign that said, "Private area under DSBUTE," was obviously something she had put up. Not official, not legal, not even logical. But it sent a clear message. She wasn't done. She was preparing for something. And whatever was coming next would decide how this entire conflict ended. The sign standing at the edge of his driveway stayed in his mind the whole night. It wasn't an official sign, not even close. But the message behind it bothered him. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore. It wasn't about trucks or trailers. It was about control. It was about a neighbor who wanted to push until something broke. And he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting himself break. The next morning, he woke up early again. The first thing he did was look outside. The sign was still there, tilted slightly from the wind, but very much in its place. He sighed, grabbed his phone, and took a picture of it. He didn't know what she was planning next, but he wanted everything documented. The house was quiet, and for a moment he allowed himself to enjoy the calm. But then he heard a voice outside hers. Loud, sharp, and full of frustration. He opened the door and saw her standing next to a small group of people. 3 strangers were gathered near the driveway, listening as she pointed at his garage, waving her hands like she was giving a presentation. "I'm telling you," she said loudly, "this whole area is under dispute. He's using the garage for something he's not supposed to. And until we sort this out, I think it's only fair to keep the driveway open for everyone. He stepped outside and approached calmly. "Good morning," he said softly, not wanting to escalate anything. She spun around with a tight smile. "Oh, look, he finally came out. We were just discussing the situation." The strangers nodded politely at him, their faces unsure. He gave them a small nod back. "There's no dispute," he said gently. "This is private property." One of the strangers spoke up. "We're contractors. She called us about possibly expanding her yard access. We're just here to give an estimate." He blinked. "Yard access?" His driveway wasn't even connected to her yard. "Your yard doesn't extend here," he said politely, still trying to keep the peace. She interrupted quickly. "It's all connected at the boundary line. And the whole point is that you're blocking the only space I have to move materials." He didn't argue. He simply pointed at the actual property line marker, clearly placed several feet away. "Your boundary starts there." "Not here." Contractors looked. They walked over. They inspected the marker. One of them whispered something to the others. Finally, one turned back to her and said, "Ma'am, your yard doesn't reach this area. We can't do anything with this space. It's not yours." Her smile dropped instantly. Well, he moved the marker. She insisted. The contractors shook their heads and began heading back to their truck. "We're sorry, but we can't take a job here. It's not permitted." She glared at him, hard as the contractors drove away. Then she stormed back inside her house, slamming the door so loudly that even he jumped a little. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply. Things were getting out of hand, and he knew he had to stop this before it spiraled further. He decided to call the sheriff's department and report everything properly: the sign, the trailer, the attempt to involve contractors. They told him they'd send someone by later. For the rest of the morning, he tried to focus on work, but it was hard. Every time he heard her door open or close, he felt his chest tighten. He wasn't scared. He was tired. Tired of the games, tired of the arguments, tired of the constant pressure. Around noon, there was a knock on his door. He opened it and saw 2 officers standing there, one of them the same officer he had spoken to a few days earlier. "We got your report," the officer said kindly. "Mind if we take a look at everything?" He nodded and walked them outside. He showed them the sign first. They took pictures. He explained what happened with the contractors. They wrote everything down. As they were finishing up, the neighbor suddenly burst out of her house. "What are you doing?" she demanded, marching toward them. The officers turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, we're responding to a report about unauthorized placement of property and possible harassment." She let out a bitter laugh. "Harassment? He's the one harassing me. He's blocking my access. He has a secret deal with the department, and he thinks that makes him untouchable."
Oh.
One of the officers took a small step forward. "Ma'am, the garage and the driveway are legally his property, and the lease is fully documented. We've reviewed everything. You need to stop interfering." She opened her mouth as if she wanted to argue again, but the officer raised a hand gently. "We're not here to fight. We're here to keep the peace. But your actions need to stop. No more trucks. No more trailers. No more trying to stake signs. If any of this continues, we will have to take further action." For the first time, she didn't speak. She simply stood there, breathing heavily, eyes darting between the officers and him. Then, without a word, she turned around and walked back to her house and closed the door quietly. The officers stayed for a few more minutes, explaining the next steps. They told him they would file everything officially and that it would be noted as a pattern if anything else happened. When they left, he felt an enormous wave of relief wash over him. Not because everything was solved, but because, for the first time, someone had drawn a firm boundary for her. He finally sat down on his porch and let himself relax. The sun was warm, the breeze calm. It felt like the first peaceful moment in days. But the story wasn't quite over. Late in the afternoon, he noticed movement next door. He looked out and saw the neighbor walking toward him, not with anger, but with a slow, uneasy expression. She stopped a few feet away. "I didn't want it to get this far," she said quietly, surprising him. He didn't respond. He just waited. "I felt like everything was closing in, like I had no control." Her voice trembled. "I thought if I pushed back, maybe I could get some space. Maybe I could fix things." He nodded slowly. We could have talked. I'm not against helping, but the driveway. The garage. Those things aren't up for debate. She looked down. I know. There was a long pause. Then she said, I'll take the sign down. He nodded again. All right. She walked back, pulled the sign out of the ground, and carried it into her garage. The street felt lighter immediately, for the first time since all of this began. The conflict finally seemed to settle. In the evening, he sat on his porch again, watching the sun go down. The driveway was clear. The garage was untouched. There were no trucks, no trailers, no arguments, just quiet. And he realized sometimes standing your ground doesn't mean fighting. Sometimes it just means staying steady until the storm passes. And this storm finally had passed. He glanced at the garage one last time and couldn't help but smile a little. Not because he won anything, but because peace had finally returned, and he hoped it would stay that way.